Okay.
They're ready for whoever's on.
Okay. Employees of DHEC, thank you so much for coming up. I hope that you all have been listening to the testimony throughout the day and maybe preparing some answers for some of the questions you may receive. Is there any particular staff member that would like to say anything or before we get started? Are you simply here to answer questions? Dr. Simmer, if you'd like to come up since you're the agency director and just say a couple of words before we begin questions.
I'd be happy to. Senator Corbin, thank you for the opportunity to address the listening session this afternoon, and members, good to see all of you. I just want to open very briefly, because I know it's late, to say that, I think we've heard a lot of different comments over the last 6 hours. We have been listening, yes. And obviously, reasonable people can differ on some of these issues. I will say that I am very proud of the DHEC team and the work they've done over the last 3 years with the pandemic, often working late hours, weekends. I think we've learned a lot over the last 2.5 years. But again, my hat is off to our team. I think they've done an incredible job, and also to the partners that we've worked with, many partners across the state. We could not have responded to this crisis without them. So that's really all I have to say in opening, sir, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you and the panel may have.
Okay. I don't have an exact protocol for this, but why don't we just begin with, we'll just take the panel here, the committee members, and go one by one through. And if any of us, we can start with Senator Garrett from Greenwood. If you'd like to begin, if you have any questions for DHEC, now's your opportunity. And some of the questions, that I may have in mind may get answered with your questions. But
thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Zimmer, for coming today. I too want to thank the DHEC for doing the response that they did do. I'm concerned, however, as reasonable people can differ, I also can differ as it relates to what have we done since. Yep. I'm concerned, let me ask you this, have you directed, or has any member of your staff directed any analysis of all of these people that have been sick in South Carolina?
We certainly look at the various data. I do that myself, but I know our team does that as well. They do not, the federal government does not give us the actual names and the addresses, so it's not like we can reach out to these individuals and ask them questions. But we do certainly track that data. What I will tell you is from my review of the various data, the vast majority of what is in there is relatively mild side effects that we expect, that we know, and we certainly caution people about, right? That has to be part of the informed consent. But most of what is in there is things like pain at the injection site, fatigue for a day or two after the vaccine, which when I got the vaccine, I had that too. So most of what is in there is relatively mild, but we do certainly track that data and watch it specifically for the people of South Carolina, although we are certainly aware of the nationwide data as well, sir.
How many people died in South Carolina from COVID?
We are now over 20,000. Obviously that number changes, but we're a little over 20,000 people having died from COVID in South Carolina at this point.
And you've got the breakdown of ages?
Yes, sir, we do.
And how many children have died from COVID?
0 to 17 is 42, sir.
42 people?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
42 children, yes, sir.
All right, and out of all of those people that died, how many of them took the COVID the COVID vaccine?
We don't know that because we're not always told that when people die.
I mean, wouldn't that be kind of something that we ought, especially going forward? Now, I'm not trying to pick on anybody, okay? Because I know what y'all do. Y'all work hard, and I appreciate that. But we got a lot of stuff we need to be doing here that we're not doing. I don't believe that this is the last virus that we're going to see. I believe that China or whoever else, now that they know they can do that and cripple America, will do it to us again. And I just feel like we got to do something. We got to do a lot more than what we're doing. That data needs to be found out. Y'all need to know if these viruses, if these treatments have DNA in them that can change someone's DNA. Don't you agree with that?
Yes, sir. I would note that plasmid DNA, which was discussed earlier, is actually used as a medical treatment.
Well, I understand
it's not inherently a harmful substance per se. So I did want to clarify that. But certainly I think it's important that people know what's in the vaccine, yes.
The doctor also said that he hasn't done the studies to see whether or not the DNA has gotten into their stem cells.
Correct.
Where if it has, that's a real bad thing. Would you agree with that?
I think it would depend what it did when it got there. I think part of what Dr. Burkholder said was he would want to see was there any negative outcomes, and I think that's a very important question.
Okay. I mean, is that something that you're going to do?
We don't have the ability to do that at DHEC. We don't have the resources or the authority, for that matter, to do that. We would certainly support someone else doing that, though, yes.
Why don't you have the authority? Aren't you, I read this statute, you've got the statute that says you're all, this section 44-180, duties and powers of boards as to communicable or epidemic diseases. What do you mean you don't have the authority?
Well, I would say two things. First of all, we're not a research organization in terms of actually doing bench research. We don't have the facilities or the resources to do that sort of work. Now, MUSC may.
That's what I'm saying. Aren't you over MUSC?
No, sir, I'm not.
Is that not a hospital?
It is a medical system. There is an
DHEC
MUSC
doesn't
hospital.
regulate them?
We license them, and we do regulate them for safety issues, but I cannot order MUSC to do a particular research project. I do not have that authority.
You can't ask them?
I can ask them, but I can't order them to.
All right, you can ask them, and we can
Yes, sir.
try to get to some of the statistics. We heard a lot of things in here today that's shocking to me. If it's true, I don't know if it's true or not, doctor,
Yes.
but I know that if you haven't looked at these people that died in South Carolina and compared them to the number of people that took the vaccine, then we don't have the data we need to even come to any conclusions here. That's simply not acceptable. We have to figure out how we're going to get from here to there, because this is not the last time we're going to see this, doctor.
Yes, sir.
I'm just concerned that we're not being aggressive as I hope we could be. And I'm just asking you, could you keep an open mind on that and really go after it?
Yes, and certainly, as I said, I would be very interested to see the results of the study that Dr. Burkholder proposed. Do I think DHEC has the capacity to do it internally? No. But I think if we would certainly support someone else doing it.
Well, certainly, if you want these studies done, you can come to us and ask us for money, and we'll make sure you are our head. I mean, you're the person that we look to make sure this kind of analysis is done.
Yes.
So we're gonna be looking to you to get these things done for us, doctor.
Yes.
If you think they're, and if you don't think these things are worthwhile, then tell us. Sure. What I don't want us to do is to follow the regimented FDA, whatever the federal government tells us. I'm worried. That doctor said just a moment ago that y'all sent out something saying that these vaccines are fine and they work, and don't be prescribing, hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin. Did y'all really do that? Did you tell doctors that?
We have said that we believe the data shows that the vaccines are safe and effective, yes, and I think that is true. We don't have any authority to tell a doctor what to prescribe or not. We have obviously some limited authority over controlled substances, but neither ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine is a controlled substance. And we have no authority there.
Those medicines have been used for years. You're familiar with that.
Yes, of course.
And have a great success rate for their various things that they treat, lupus and a host of other things.
Yes, and parasitic diseases, yes.
Malaria and whatnot. So all I'm saying is that I'm concerned that, number one, our medical profession is having to fight an uphill battle when it's trying to treat its patients. So we do need freedom with doctors and the patients. We don't need DHEC telling them what they can and can't do, unless they're doing something that's dangerous.
Right.
Seems to me that giving them the vaccine that have been untested is more dangerous than giving them something like ivermectin.
So, and again, we have no authority to tell a doctor what they can or cannot prescribe, and we don't, and we will not do that. So,
All right, let me ask you about masks. Let me ask you about masks for a minute.
Yes, sir.
I see you have one on.
I do, and let me explain why. I'm actually, thankfully, knock on wood, relatively healthy. If I got COVID, it would probably be a mild case. However, my wife is very high risk.
Okay.
Protecting my wife's health, as we've discussed, is very, very important to me. And so I'm really wearing the mask to protect her.
And I don't have any problem. Look, individual freedom, you can wear 14 masks. That's fine with me. I don't have a problem with that.
Yes, sir.
At all. But making kids wear masks when they don't work bothers me badly. And I'm just wondering, why was I read what your requirements are about wearing masks and whatnot. Why are we telling our kids that they have to wear masks in South Carolina?
I believe there is data that shows that masks, although they are not a panacea by any means, And certainly cloth masks in particular, I think as we've learned more about the virus, we've learned that cloth masks are not the most effective way to stop the virus because of the size of the particle and such. A KN95 mask like this actually works pretty well.
Do we have 95 masks for our kids?
Yes, they do exist.
We do?
Yes.
So do we need, as a Senate body, prescribe 95 masks for all the kids in South Carolina?
No, sir. I think
Why not?
I think where we are with COVID right now, where the numbers are moderate to low,
Okay.
and we know more than we did 2.5 years ago that the effects for COVID, although some children do get very sick, to be sure, and as I mentioned, there have been some deaths. For most children.
You say 42?
42, yes, sir.
42?
And there's
Okay.
been about 300 cases of the multi-inflammatory system syndrome in children, which is a very debilitating disease. But again, those are small numbers, but obviously not small if you're the family with a child with the
To
disease.
the family, yeah,
of
for
course.
sure.
But I think knowing what the risk level is now, I think most children do not need to wear a mask. I don't think that the risk level justifies it.
I understand, but that's not what your statement as it relates to schools says, is it?
I don't believe that we currently recommend generalized mask wearing in schools.
Okay.
Now, I will tell you, I'll be the first to tell you that we are working diligently on our website, which is a challenge. And if there is an outdated page there, please tell us and we will get rid of it. We are constantly working on that website. I can tell you when we become the new agency in July, you'll see a completely different website. We've already contracted that out because we know our current website is not ideal.
Doctor, I know y'all are under tremendous pressure. Don't misunderstand. Again, I'm not trying to be mean-spirited at all in these
course.
questions that I'm asking. I'm worried about South Carolina. I'm not worried as much about the federal government. The federal government can do what they want to do. But aren't we an independent state?
Yes, sir.
Aren't we a sovereign state?
Yes, sir.
Do we have to rely upon the federal government to tell us how to best protect the people of South Carolina?
I think it should be a partnership.
I
I
agree.
think the federal government has some things to offer, yes.
But if some of this stuff that we heard today is absolutely true, and if it's found to be true, then we've all been hoodwinked, including you.
Yes. So,
And if we've been hoodwinked and our people are in danger, then it's up to us to take steps to fix it.
yes, sir.
Do we agree with that?
Yes, sir.
So the broadness of the questions that were asked today seemed to me to be, we need to go ahead and put emphasis where it needs to be put in studies, okay? Because now we've got a lot of people. There's a lot of information, a lot of study out there now,
Right.
a lot of data.
Yes.
And you're telling me that because they didn't give you the data, we couldn't do the studies on South Carolinians? That's unacceptable. I mean, how do we get that data?
Well, I mean, I think, we can, and we do have some data on deaths from the death certificates. And of course, as the state registrar, I have the deaths, I have access to those.
Okay.
But I think beyond that, and, we do work with the hospitals who track hospitalization data.
Well, what about autopsies? I mean, I'm hearing that, that a lot of people were wanting autopsies and they weren't being able to be prescribed. I mean, is there some reason that we as a government, we as South Carolina didn't want to look at those autopsies?
No, sir. We've never discouraged autopsies at
Okay.
DHEC.
All right.
I can definitely say that.
And if-
I think there are some challenges simply with volume and having enough people to do the autopsies. But again, that's really a decision for the local coroner, the local, the person who's declaring the death. And the family often has a role in that too.
Certainly.
But we have no opposition to doing autopsies at all.
So if it was actually something from the national side down not to do the autopsies, because I was told, listen, I had a nurse tell me that the docs were putting everybody who died had said they had COVID, and the reason they said they had COVID was so they get all that extra money. I don't know if there's any truth to that or not. Again, I take everything I hear with a grain of salt. But if it's true and those numbers are skewed, we need to know that too.
Yes.
If the deaths aren't as many caused by COVID, we need to know that too. Whether it's good or bad or ugly, we need to know the actual truth, and we need to get some answers pretty soon. Because again, I'm comfortable that we're going to have this again, and I want to let me ask you another question.
Yes.
About all these drugs, whether it's ivermectin or hydrochloroquine, or whether it's remdesivir or just whatever drugs we need. can we stockpile those? Because I was told, and I'm pretty sure that's the case, that there was a situation where the federal government was preventing some parts of South Carolina from getting that drug.
I don't know what drug that would be. I'm not aware of the federal government preventing us from getting something. There were, they did, some like the monoclonal antibodies, they gave a certain amount to each state based on the state's population and the disease level in that state, because there was only so much monoclonal antibody to go around. The other challenge with monoclonal antibodies is we really can't stockpile them, and I know that was one of the questions you gave us, for two reasons. One is they don't have a very long shelf life, and two, because they're really very variant specific. So actually we don't currently have any effective monoclonal antibodies because none of the current variants respond to the ones we had. So even if we had them stockpiled, it wouldn't do us any good. But could we stockpile other medications? I suppose we could. Again, there will be a shelf life, right?
Well, what is your opinion on hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin? Is it effective treatment for COVID, the original COVID, or not?
I can tell you that there are many studies. Last time I testified in a hearing like this, my comment was that for ivermectin, we needed more research. A lot of that research has now been done. As much as I wish it had turned out otherwise, my reading of that research is that it does not work well for COVID, for treatment of COVID.
It does not work well.
It does not work well for treatment of COVID. There are now multiple studies that show that, and they looked at various things. Patients in the hospital, patients not in the hospital, patients with mild disease, severe disease. So there are a number of different ways that they've gone at this. But those studies have really very consistently not shown that it works for COVID, which is unfortunate. I wish it did. And I think the same has been found for hydroxychloroquine. Now, what I would say for ivermectin is it's reasonably safe in the human doses. I certainly discourage people from taking the animal dose, which is much too high. But in human doses, it's safe. Hydroxychloroquine, there's actually been some significant side effects with.
Well, let me just ask, and I know there's different COVID, different variants, and different treatment modalities, I'm sure, for each. But just like personal protection gear, that kind of thing, if we need it. Again, I'm not sure if we need masks or not based on everything that I've seen. I'm not sure of the studies that you heard on ivermectin, by the way. We heard all this science up here about scientific method and scientific methods of review and the scientific method, and it seems to me that anybody can skew anything if they want to. So it concerns me. I got two South Carolina doctors here who have treated people with ivermectin in their practices, and it's worked. It's worked for me personally. Again, I'm not talking about me personally. I'm talking about those folks have treated 500 patients or more. And then the other thing that sounds exciting to me is that most of their patients that they did treat, didn't have any problems, didn't have to go get hospitalized. And the ones that they had been treating before didn't get the disease to start with. That's tremendous. I mean, again, I don't know what the science is maybe in New York, but why haven't we done any science here in South Carolina? We got great research facilities. So it just seems to me that we need to come up with a list of things that we all can agree on and work towards having some South Carolina studies done. I would prefer for our studies to be done here. The ones you're referring to, where were they done?
All across the country. In fact, some were overseas.
Any
all across the country.
Any in South Carolina?
Not as a primary research site. There certainly have been some studies where MUSC was one of the sites that was involved.
Is this a man-made virus, or do you think this is natural virus?
I have no way of knowing that, sir.
Okay, you don't have an opinion on that?
I think either is possible. There are certainly other viruses that have moved from animals to people. It is certainly possible it was created in the lab, and I simply don't have firsthand knowledge to be able to answer that.
Certainly, I understand that. Then immunity. Explain what 57 means.
I saw that.
See that?
I did see that, yes, sir.
Okay.
I think that refers to a test which is used actually for cancer patients.
Okay.
So I don't know that it would apply well in this setting. I am not aware of any test that gives you a number that says this is your immunity level against COVID-19.
I was in the Senate. I talked to the nurse and I said, look, I got to go to Washington, D.C., and they're telling me I got to take this vaccine. I'm not going to take it. But I sure would like to go because there's some important things I'd like to hear up there. So I went over to the Senate and I asked the doctor who was there, I said, can you give me a quick COVID test? And he did.
Sure.
And then I said, well, what does it say? He said, it's 57. And I said, well, what does that mean? He said, you're bulletproof.
Well, I'd love to talk to him and know what he did, because I
Okay.
do not know.
All right, so that's not a common thing?
No, sir. But again, if you put me in touch with him, I would be interested to talk to him.
That's fine, okay. Then what about natural immunities? Do you agree that natural immunities ought to be tested before we start giving people more and more and more vaccines?
If we had a reliable test for it, I would say yes.
We don't have a reliable test for immunity?
Not for COVID-19. And the reason for that, because, for example, we do have a reliable test for measles, where we can test whether you are immune to measles or not before we decide to give you a shot. Now, the Navy actually did that to me. They said, your immune level's too low. They gave me the shot. But for COVID-19, because it's relatively new, we don't know what level of antibodies in the blood actually confers reliable immunity. That's a good area for research. I hope people do that. But as of today, we don't have sufficient data to know that. I hope we do someday.
Well, I mean, you heard what these doctors are saying, that these situations are such that, you know, if they built up immunities and then you give them a shot on top of it, then you got adverse effects. At least that should have been discovered in looking at these deaths in South Carolina to see whether or not the vaccine itself is causing these deaths or causing these problems. My son-in-law developed a clot. He's 41 years old. He developed a clot right after taking that. And he's been sick ever since with all kind of problems, hypertension and everything that he didn't have before. I don't know whether it's related. Again, y'all are the scientists. I'm just a father-in-law who's concerned
Of course.
for
Yes,
the
sir.
father of my grandchildren. But it just seems to me that a lot of these things, you know, are just, what studies have we done?
Nationwide or?
No, in South Carolina. What studies have we done in South Carolina about any of this?
MUSC, as I said, and they're really the lead study institution in our state, although U of SC Medicine certainly does some too.
What have they studied concerning this COVID virus?
They have been one of the study sites looking at the effectiveness of vaccines in children. They've
Okay.
done several studies on that. But again, they've been one of several sites. They're not doing it alone. So I know they've done several vaccine studies there. I believe they've done some other work, but I couldn't tell you all the details.
Do you think we should give these vaccines to children?
I think we should offer it to parents and let parents make the choice in consultation with the child's provider. I think that should be a parental choice.
Senator, can I inject something?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Do you feel, Dr. Simmer, do you feel comfortable as DHEC's position to go out there and support the CDC's recommendation that the vaccines are safe and effective down to a 6-month-old child?
Having looked at the data myself and having looked at that research myself, yes. Now, are there side effects? Yes. And I think people need to know about those. We need to give good informed consent. But I think for most people, not everyone, but for most people, the benefits of the vaccine do outweigh the risks.
Okay. Now, based on what research would you say they're safe and effective?
There's been any number of studies, many of which are actually in the information that we provided you, looking at what is the rate of infection, both infection, and I will say that the vaccines do wane with time about preventing someone from getting COVID. But what they are good for longer term, and there's a number of studies in your package that show this.
Wait, just a minute. I don't
Yes,
think
sir.
the vaccine prevents you from getting COVID.
It does reduce your risk for a period of time. It does. But that effect does wane with time, absolutely, and gets less. So what they are, though, is that for a number of months after the vaccine, they have been shown to reduce your risk of hospitalization and death due to COVID. And for most people, that's what's most important.
And well, I'm gonna stop here because I interrupted on my colleague's time. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. Senator, I was pretty well agreed.
You sure?
Yes, I'm agreed.
Okay. Next, let's let Chairman Davis ask her questions if you have.
Thank you. Thank you for pulling us together, Senator Corbin, and thank you for all of those who came and spoke with us today. I think we've heard a lot of good information, and I call it good because I think some of it was bad information. in that I think it was serious information and information that I feel obligated to do something with. And so I will be asking my assistant here to put together a to-do list
Okay.
of things that we need to follow back up on. And I'm wondering Has DHEC gone through a process where you've analyzed what was done right and what was done wrong during and after the pandemic? And do you have a list of action items that you're working on?
So, answer to both is yes, we have done a review, and we do have a list of things that we're working on. Again, I think we've learned a lot during this evolution, and although I very much hope we don't have to do this again for a very long time, I certainly agree with Senator Garrett, the risk is there. So yes, we are working on a number of things. There are things I think we could have and should have done better, and we are working on making sure, one, that we do those better now, because right, there is still COVID here, we still need to provide information, but certainly also that we're prepared to do those things better if, heaven forbid, we have to do this again.
Right, good. So do you have that in a format where you can provide that information to us so that we can see what you identified and how you plan to address it?
Yes.
Okay.
So we can get that to you in writing. I can give you a very short summary right now if you'd like. I think one thing we need to do a much better job is communication. I think when we make recommendations, we need to explain to people why we are making those recommendations. I don't think we always did that as well as we should have. So I think one is explaining our recommendations better and showing the evidence of that we're relying on to make those. I think another thing that we've learned is, that we will, I think, work much harder to keep children in school. I think that's very important. One of the things we're doing right now is we've purchased over 7,000 filtration devices for schools, air filtration, that filter out things like the flu virus and the COVID virus, which help keep children in school. And for those schools, we've also, for those schools that have the HVAC systems that support it, we're buying them high-quality filters that do the same thing. Again, those things don't impact the children at all in terms of their learning, but it does make it a safer environment for them. So I think keeping children in school, improving communication, I think are two things that are hallmarks of what we're going to really are focused on both for today and then moving forward.
I really wish we would have bought the air filtration systems while our kids were out of school, so that we could get them back into school more quickly. And I'll also say that the concept of informed consent has to requires that people be informed. Yeah. And in order to be informed, right, we need to communicate that information to them, but they need to understand the risks associated with these vaccines. They need to fully understand the kind of decision that they're making. And then I also want to talk for a minute about the money associated with COVID. On a federal government level, there was a report that was put out by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, funding and spending as of January 31st, 2023. And the federal government has provided about $4.6 trillion to help the nation respond to and recover from COVID. That is an unprecedented amount of money. Now, I believe the state of South Carolina received $1.9 billion of that. And that money was sent to states and other organizations as a result of several bills that were passed in Congress. I've seen in the media over the last few months, I've really started paying attention to this, numerous cases of fraud and abuse of that money. I'm wondering if there's someone in your organization or perhaps another organization that is looking at all of that $1.9 billion that came into the state of South Carolina to ensure not only, number one, that it's been fully accounted for and it was spent without as purpose, as it was intended to be spent. But also that we're following up on that, and we're making sure that if there is excess money, that we're doing something with it. The last I understood, there were several organizations, I believe, that had money sort of in the bank, COVID money that's sitting there. I would demand that there be some sort of reporting and accounting for that money, and if it's not accounted for, that it be clawed back. And put back into the state taxpayer's pocket. So, do you have any action items associated with the dollars that have been spent through your agency?
Yes, and obviously, we can only track what came to our agency. You know, some of the things like the PPP loans are outside of our scope, where there has indeed been some fraud. But certainly, we are tracking very closely the funds that we have received. We require everyone, and this is not just for COVID funds, but anyone who gets funds from our agency as a subrecipient or as a grantee, they have to have specific outcomes that they are going to achieve with those funds. They have to document to us that they have achieved those. We will consider clawing back if they do not use the funds appropriately. Our chief financial officer, who's somewhere behind the post for me, but Darby McPhail is our chief financial officer. She has an outstanding team. And they are watching very closely how the money is being used, that it's being used appropriately. And there will likely be some funds that we do not use, and we will return that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I have a feeling that you're going to see a request for that information,
Yes.
and we will request it. I'm fairly sure. I know this is one thing that I want to advocate for, that we would request from every agency that received part of those federal dollars, that we ask for a full accounting of that money.
And
Thank
I will
you.
tell you that we regularly do report that to the JBRC. And I believe we did provide you with those reports, but we're happy to answer additional questions.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Chairman Davis. Senator Cash.
Hello, Dr. Zimmer.
Hello.
If y'all were watching the testimony, then I'm sure you're familiar with the number 37,000 reported deaths related to the COVID vaccines.
I saw that.
And, the comparison to previous vaccines. I think one vaccine was pulled off the market after 32 deaths. So, what's your response to that when in relation to the belief of DHEC, that the vaccine is safe and effective?
I think we have to put that number into context. The deaths are generally considered to be 7 days after the vaccine. And if you look at 2019 data, so pre-vaccine, an average of about, because that 37,000 is nationwide, was my understanding. An average of about 7,500 people died per day for whatever reason in the United States per day in 2019. And again, I'm using that year because there was no COVID vaccine yet. If you look at that times 7 days, that works out to about 52,000 people that will die for whatever reason unrelated to COVID vaccine in a given week in the United States. If you look at the number of people who've received at least one dose of the COVID vaccine, it's about 270 million nationwide, a little bit more than that. And so if you then say, well, if you have 270 million people who received the vaccine, just through coincidence, through happenstance, how many would you expect to die within a week of receiving that vaccine? Turns out that number is about 39,000. So in reality, when I look at that number, I think that the 37,000 deaths that are reported are actually pretty consistent with coincidental deaths that may have had nothing to do with the vaccine. Now, do I think that when there's a death reported, we should investigate? Yes, we should. But that number doesn't particularly alarm me because I don't think it's any higher than what we would expect from just people dying from completely unrelated causes, whether it's a heart attack or cancer or whatever else, that did not relate to the vaccine. If there was a market increase compared to what I would expect, then I would be concerned.
So it sounds like you are discounting that number in terms of agreeing that it's COVID-related,
Yes.
vaccine-related deaths.
Correct.
But, Dr. Simmer, I think my feeling, and perhaps some of the other committee members' feelings, is that, well, if we knew if these deaths were related to the COVID vaccine, that would be something different. And yet, when we're asking how much investigation has been done into these deaths in South Carolina,
Right.
we don't feel like we're getting a very satisfactory answer from the agency we would expect to be compiling that data and finding out about COVID-related deaths in South Carolina. So there's something there that this doesn't quite satisfy me when you just dismiss out of hand these 37,000 deaths, and yet we don't seem to be digging too hard into the deaths in South Carolina. I want to move on real quick to something that got mentioned towards the end of the hearing, which was the debacle we had with keeping children out of school. I remember clearly, Dr. Zimmer, that certainly by the middle of the summer of 2020, we knew fairly well that school-aged children were not severely affected by COVID, by getting COVID. And yet somehow we stumbled on into the fall with schools doing all manner of things across this state, going part-time, going every other day, not going at all. I just want you to respond. How is it that we allowed that to happen when we knew so early on that it was people, elderly people, people with comorbidities that were at risk, and very little risk to school-aged children? How did we stumble into that educational debacle?
Well, let me just say, I was not here in July of 2020, so I don't want to speak for decisions that might have been made. However, what I can say is this. I think there were a couple of concerns. One is that early in the pandemic, I still think that many people weren't sure what the impact on children would be. The preliminary data was promising, but I think people wanted to see more. The second big concern I think there was those children were going home where they would be around people who were at high risk, grandparents, others who had, comorbidities, as you said. And there was a significant concern about them spreading the disease to those who were high risk and then causing deaths or serious illness in that population. So I think those were some of the reasons. Some schools obviously approach this different than others. Different school boards, I presume, listening to their constituencies, made decisions. I can't speak for why each school board did what they did. But I think on a public health basis, those were two of the major concerns in the summer of 2020.
Just one more thing, Dr. Simmer. This is just more of a concern than a question. It is my opinion that DHEC should be thinking independently, not just taking whatever is handed down from the federal government in concerns of these pandemic recommendations and guidelines. And it's my belief that we were just basically doing whatever came out of Washington. So my concern is that there are people at DHEC who are skeptical of what I would call big government, big pharma, and big tech. Because I'm skeptical of big government, big pharma, and big tech. Sure. And it's my impression that among those three institutions, that they were all promoting the same party line with very little critical or skeptical thinking. Rather, they were just all reinforcing one another and let's shut our ears to anything different. I'm probably wrong in saying this, but just as a citizen, I wonder if the entire response of the nation emanating out of Washington, D.C. wasn't driven by one person named Dr. Fauci. One person dictating our COVID response.
Well, I can't answer that, frankly. What I would say is that there were a number of times where we at DHEC deviated from CDC recommendations. For example, we opened schools earlier. We allowed children to be in school more than CDC recommended because of our own independent review of the evidence and some other states that had tried that. We thought it was effective and safe. So we actually did, and it's in the package of information that we submitted. And if you look at Appendix B, you'll see there's a whole list of areas where we deviated from CDC guidance, almost always being less restrictive than CDC. So I think we did try to make independent decisions. As I said, it has to be a partnership. Do we consider what CDC recommendations are? Yes, we do. They have very smart people that work there too. So we certainly do consider what they recommend. But we do make our own independent decisions and did multiple times during the pandemic.
One last thing, and then I'll pass it off. Are you aware of what's come out about the Humetrics study about vaccine effectiveness that apparently the CDC had in hand for a year without releasing the information to the other parts of the government about the waning effectiveness of the vaccines. Are you familiar with that?
I'm certainly aware of studies that show that the vaccine effectiveness wanes. Whether the CDC withheld that, I have no way of knowing.
Well, they did, and it gets back to people's trust in government
Sure.
and how much trust we should put on what's coming out of the federal government if there's being evidence suppressed by agencies that are supposed to be operating in the best interest of public health. Thank you, Dr. Simmer.
Yes, sir.
Senator Garrett.
I've been thinking about the future again. I'm always thinking about our future. I'm worried about us depending upon our drugs in South Carolina from China or anywhere else, or our personal protection gear or whatever. I believe that every state ought to have its own sufficient amount of medicines, compounds, or whatever we need to be able to sustain our people.
Sure.
So is there anything under any study where we're talking about developing sufficient manufacture of compounding or things that we may need for our state, unrelated to other states? If we've got extra, fine. I'm tickled to death that we send out to someone else. But I'm concerned that South Carolina needs to be it needs to be independent. It needs to be independent with food stuff, manufacture, transportation, everything. We need to be independent. Energy, we need to be completely independent. And I'm going to look to you folks, I think, to help us get there, whether it's manufacture or whatever. But y'all need to tell us the quantities and lay the foundation so we can get with the Department of Commerce and make sure that throughout the state of South Carolina we're producing whatever we need, whether it's, for future pandemics, or the President Trump went in and built all of these resuscitating machines all of a sudden, and of course then they didn't need as many as he had built. But I want to be prepared like that. So have y'all given any thought to that, to our future, to get us away from China or other countries that may be mean to us or don't care for us very much? That we may need to have our own source of medicine.
I think it is certainly beneficial for us to have as much of the medicine produced domestically, and by that I mean within the United States, as possible. And that is not currently the case.
Is that currently the case?
No, it is not. No, sir. Much of the medicine that actually is used comes from overseas, is manufactured overseas, often in U.S.-owned factories, but from overseas still, and subject, therefore, to a number of issues. I think, we can certainly give you at least a rough estimate of what it would take to manufacture all required medication in South Carolina. I think that would be a very difficult thing to do. There's a credible number of different medications. And they are manufactured in many different places. I think, in most factories, most pharmaceutical factories manufacture certain medications only. They don't produce 80, 100, 120 different medicines. So, again, we can try to estimate what is being used in the state as best as we can. I don't know that we can get you an exact number.
Especially, Dr. Zimmer, insulin, for instance, are
Yes.
the drugs that we need the most of, that we really can't do without.
Sure.
I mean, we were at a point in time where there were some threats that they may withhold some of that medicine from us based upon our response and what we were doing. I just don't think that South Carolina, if the rest of the country wants to do that, that's their business.
Right.
But I don't think South Carolina needs to be in that position. And it's fine if we get it from other states. I would prefer for it to be built here because,
Yes, of course.
We got states doing some crazy things out there that I don't want to see replicated in South Carolina. So it's something that I'd like to talk with you about. Maybe
Absolutely.
You, your council, and we can talk about it.
Happy to.
But I want us to feel confident. I want to be able to talk to my constituents back home and tell them that South Carolina's different.
Yes.
We're not stuck like some of these other places. We've got a pipeline. We've got a way of getting those drugs to our people. And I know you're in charge of it, and I know you're doing a good job. Look, I
Thank
don't
you.
want you to think I'm Monday-Lord quarterback because I'm not.
Yes, sir.
Okay? I'm not. I'm worried about our future and where we're going to go. why I'm asking the question. So if you could
Yes, sir.
help me do that,
Yeah, and I think, sir, if I may propose, let's sit down, and I think we can go through some of that, and maybe identify some medications to start with that are the highest priority, the highest need, and then we can go from there. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Representative Long?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Doctor. In March of 2020, none of us really knew what we were going to be dealing with as it relates to COVID. And so when the initial recommendations were that we need to take 2 weeks and flatten the curve. And a lot of the American people are really selfless people, and when they're called upon to do something, they'll step up to the plate, they'll rise to the occasion. And so when we were all told 2 weeks, stay at home, flatten the curve, let's get this under control, we went along with it because we believe in doing something for the greater good. But 2 weeks to flatten the curve turned into 2 months stay at home, turned into 2 shots to go to work. And a lot of people have tried to kind of brush it under the rug of what went on during 2020 primarily, and then kind of into 2021. But I still remember. I remember restaurants being closed and boat ramps being closed, and my wife going to her prenatal OB appointments, and I had to go sit in the car while she had her ultrasound and things like that. And it was, in my mind, the greatest violation of constitutional rights in the history of our country. And so as we talk, we've focused a lot on kind of the public health side today, and you being in public health and at DHEC, how do you think we should square the public health response with what the Constitution says and the liberties of the people of South Carolina?
So I think that's a very important balance, and I think you bring a very good issue. Right? Obviously, there are limits to what we are allowed to do. We do give up a certain amount of freedom to avoid hurting others. That's why we don't allow people to drive drunk, for example. So there have to be some reasonable limits. I think if we knew back in March of 2020 what we do now, we would have done things differently. Absolutely. And I think we can apply some of that knowledge should, again, heaven forbid this happen again. I think certainly for those who are at the highest risk, the elderly, those who are immunocompromised, I think voluntary restrictions on their motion by themselves to protect themselves is probably very reasonable. And I think I would recommend if I had a patient in that situation that they do that. I think I would be much less likely to recommend mandatory shutdowns. I think we need to do, as I said, much more communication and say, look, if you choose to go out, this is the risk you're taking, right? And if you have an elderly person at home, you really need to think twice. Again, because there are risks here, and I think we need to be very clear about that. But I do not think that the shutting down, as you said, it may have flattened the curve a little. It didn't have a dramatic effect, and so I think we would I would certainly advocate for a different approach if there was another episode like this.
Well, it's really reassuring to me to hear you say that. Now that we've been through something like this, we can look back on it. We can look forward at what might be coming up, and that mandates and lockdowns and shutting things down is not the way that we should go, that having things be optional, informing people, educating people, but letting people make their own decisions is the way that we should go. I know that's what I'm committed to, and that's what I'm committed to helping work with anybody on. And, part of that goes back to informed consent. And we know that there's conflicting opinions, I suppose, on the use of ivermectin and HCQ, but rather than present it, kind of both sides of it, DHEC and a lot of other public health professionals seem to just discount something that there's been a tremendous amount of anecdotal support for. And then there's also been some kind of empirical or statistical support for it as well. Do you think that DHEC can kind of roll back some of their opposition to the use of medications like that?
I don't think we're opposed to its use per se. I've never told a provider not to prescribe something, and I don't believe anyone at our agency has. That's not our role. That's really the provider-patient relationship. Now, having said that, do I think it is DHEC's role to put out the best scientific information we can? Yes. And obviously, we have a dual role, right? We inform both the public and providers, and hopefully serve as a source of information for both. Again, I would say that from my reading of the literature, and I've read a lot of studies about ivermectin, I think the vast majority of that literature says that it is not effective for treatment of COVID. I think the literature on whether it prevents COVID if you take it every day is more mixed. I think that's an awfully hard burden to take a pill for every day for 3 years, frankly. But,
I'd rather do that before I get a shot.
well, understood. And that's a choice you can make, right? And I think you should have the right to make that choice. Absolutely.
Well, and as it relates to the shots, or the vaccines, however we want to try to refer to it, I understand it's not a vaccine in the traditional sense. So as we talk about kind of the informed consent piece of it, can you help me understand what your opinion is and kind of what the position of DHEC is on the very legitimate risks that might be associated with it? Because we've heard over and over again, safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective, and mum's the word on the other side of the coin. So as it relates to informed consent, the first part of that is informed.
Yes.
What's kind of your thoughts and the position of DHEC on the risks associated with the shots?
I mean, I think there are risks associated with the shots, as there is with almost anything. And the risk varies by your age, your gender, some other things. Certainly, for example, if someone has had an allergic reaction to a COVID shot, they shouldn't get a second one, period. And I think we should recommend that to them, that if it's rare, but people can have an allergic reaction to that, and that should be the end of your COVID shots. Young males, ages 18 to 24, we know have some issues with myocarditis. It's rare. Maybe 25 cases per 100,000 who get the vaccine. So it's a small number, but people should know that there is that risk out there. Most people who get the myocarditis do recover fully, and that's good news. But they should know that. They should be told that before they make a decision. And then they can make a decision. Well, maybe I've got an elderly person at home who's really high risk, so I'm willing to take that risk to protect them. On the other hand, if you're living by yourself, you're not really exposing anyone else, maybe you choose not to, and that's fine too. So yes, I think we absolutely have to give folks full informed consent, let them know what the risks are, what the benefits are, what the data shows, and then they can make their own choice, hopefully in consultation with their provider.
So, and thank you. And the first presenter this morning, the attorney, he spoke about the different kinds of trials that the vaccines go through, or I guess the lack thereof, as it and certainly since the pharmaceutical companies don't bear any kind of liability. I've got two young kids. One's 2, one's fixing to turn 1. My colleague here, Representative Morgan, just had a baby. So when we're presented with information that these vaccines, virtually all vaccines, COVID included, go through trials that last less than 6 months, and the control group is sometimes not even a true control group. I mean, how are we supposed to have confidence in vaccines, and especially the COVID vaccine, when when it appears that there's really been no kind of real vetting on the front end, that we're going to look at it on the back end, and then on the back end, even everything seems to be filtered through, and there's really no studies on the back end either. So what would you say to somebody like me who is trying to make those sorts of decisions for my family?
Well, again, I think you have to make a decision that's right for your family. It's not my place to tell you what that is. However, what I would say is that vaccines, including the COVID vaccines, go through a series of trials, and the COVID vaccines have done that. There's phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 is the typical way that this works. That's true for medications too, where phase 1 is a very basic trial, often in animals. Phase 2 is largely a safety study in healthy individuals who volunteer for that to see what side effects it causes. And then phase 3 is both safety and effectiveness, right? And the COVID vaccine has gone through that, just like all other vaccines that are currently administered in the United States. So, COVID obviously is still a relatively new vaccine. There is for every vaccine, and actually every medication, post-marketing, so post-approval, follow-up to see, are there perhaps rare side effects we didn't see in those initial studies, which is possible. For COVID, that's how the myocarditis was found. So, and there have been now a number of studies on myocarditis in COVID. So I think there are studies being done on the follow-up information, looking at that, looking at, who's at risk, how much risk, and then making sure that folks know that before they get the vaccine. So I think those things are in progress. Obviously, when you have something like the polio vaccine, which has been with us for 50 years, there's a lot more, 50 years is a long time to monitor. I think we have a very good feel for polio vaccine safety. I think we now, 2.5 years in, have a good knowledge of what COVID-19 vaccine is likely to cause, side effect-wise. If there is anything else that turns up, I think it would be something that would be very rare and therefore hard to find. Not saying it can't, So I think, what would I tell you and your family? I think look at what the risk is. Young children have a relatively low risk. If you don't have somebody in your home who's very high risk, or either because of their age or they're immunocompromised or have some other comorbidity, then the need is probably less. If there's somebody who, if they got COVID in your home, would be really potentially seriously harmed by that, then probably that might move the needle the other way a little bit.
Okay, thank you. And I'll be very brief because I know that we're fixing to try to finish up here and we're running kind of later than we expected. And I don't mean this to be disrespectful towards the DHEC as an agency or any of the staff there, but I have a tremendous amount more confidence in the doctors that presented today, including Dr. Jackson, Dr. DeVore, and others, than I do in DHEC as an agency. And what does DHEC do to kind of look at both sides of an issue and to take the I guess the conflicting viewpoints that I see from the doctors that treat patients on a daily basis? What does DHEC do to take their opinion into consideration when making their recommendations, and what maybe could DHEC do to improve on how they're taking those differing opinions?
Certainly, if someone comes to us with concerns, we listen. You heard from Dr. Hilty today. I have met with her several times for a number of hours, including once with Senator Verdon and his staff, and then subsequently at DHEC, because she came by and we talked for quite a while. And certainly, I can tell you no one else who's testified here today has reached out to us. If they had, I would have sat down and talked with them. I'm still willing to do that, very happy to. So, I think one thing is that we do listen when people raise concerns. We want to hear what their concerns are. We do consider them. I certainly, one of the things that Dr. Hilty raised that I think was very fair, and I mentioned, is the communication piece. And, we are in part moving forward on that because of her recommendations. So we do listen to when people bring concerns. Obviously, we rely heavily on the published literature. I think relying on the science is very important, and we should do that. And we need to do a better job of being transparent about what literature we rely on, and we are working on that. But certainly, if people come to us, we want to hear from them. We want to talk with them, regardless of what their position is. I've met with the Moms for Liberty group in Beaufort County, and they raised some valid concerns too, and we had a good talk with them. So again, I'm more than happy to sit down with anyone like that who would like to talk with us.
Okay, well, and I just know, and last comment, I promise. So, but when you say that we're going to trust the science and the literature and things like that, most of that comes out of the federal government. And I trust the doctors more than I trust the state government. And I have absolutely no trust or confidence whatsoever in the federal government and their ability to handle any of these kinds of situations. And I know that's my opinion. I know that's the opinion for a lot of people in my district as well. So when we talk about trusting the science and everything, and it's coming out of D.C., I don't trust that. And neither do my constituents. And I would much rather have DHEC put a lot more emphasis in listening to the doctors that are within the state of South Carolina. So anyways, thank you so much for allowing me to talk for a few minutes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Long. And I want to go to the other two members on the panel, but since you brought up the question about the vaccine and the trials, I just want to ask you a question. Dr. Simmer, wouldn't you agree that on the average or typically it takes 5 to 7 years to do clinical trials on vaccines? Isn't that the norm?
Not always, no, sir. Early on, for example, when the polio vaccine was rolled out, I do not believe they studied it for 5 to 7 years.
Everybody that I've talked to said that that's still typically the norm, and that it takes 5 to 7 years to do good clinical trials on a vaccine.
I think certainly having 5 years of post-marketing information is valuable, yes, and that's why we track that. But I think that if you look back in history, certainly some of the early vaccines were rolled out in less than 5 to 7 years.
And a lot of them were recalled, weren't they? With just a handful of deaths.
A few were, many were not.
Okay. Yeah. So from the time they began researching on this COVID vaccine, and it didn't happen until after COVID hit, till the time the vaccine was rolled out, how many years was that? Or let me rephrase that, how many months was that?
Operation Warp Speed, under the Trump administration ran about 8 months, I think.
And
what I would note, though, is
8 months.
8 months. However, the mRNA part of the vaccine, which is really the novel part of the vaccine, that's been studied. That's been in development and studied for many years.
Is that the same mRNA technology that killed a bunch of lab monkeys and things?
I don't think that was actually the case. That's a little bit of a misnomer, but they have been studying mRNA technology for quite some time. That was not new 8 months
Right,
in
but
March
to
of
make
2020.
it applicable for a specific virus, which is what our incident or illness, projected illness.
Of course.
I just find it perplexing that anybody would say that a vaccine is safe and effective when it takes typically 5 to 7 years to prove that, and we did it in 8 months. I just have difficulty wrapping my mind around that. Just wanted to
Yes, sir.
say that. I'll now go to Representative Morgan.
Well, it's a great segue because, and somebody else kind of already asked you that, but so DHEC is still promoting and stating that the vaccination, specifically the mRNA, Pfizer one that we've been talking about, is safe and effective.
For most people.
And that's officially from DHEC. That's on websites. We're still doing digital ads. We're still promoting that.
We're not doing a lot of ads at this point, but it is on the website, yes.
Okay, but I remember seeing it on. I think I even saw it on billboards. I think
One point,
a TV
yes.
commercial.
Yeah, certainly at one time, yes. That was
Yeah,
true.
all saying the safe and effective. And I'm a little blown away because of watching health professionals at the federal level say things basically that sound very similar. Oh, safe and effective. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, those deaths, but we don't know if those really caused it. We can tell you it's safe and effective. And I'm kind of like, it sounds exactly like that person who's saying, yeah, it's safe and effective, but we don't have any studies that say it's safe and effective. And
I would say-
I feel like there's an issue in my opinion, and I know it's in the broader public's opinion, there's an issue right now with trust from certain medical professionals. I don't think it's
Absolutely.
from a lot of doctors. I think it's from a lot of the policymakers, whether it's DHEC, whether it's CDC, because there seems to be this narrative that has been chosen by certain people and then passed on, and it's the only potential narrative. And I guess he asked a question about informed consent.
Yes.
So I have never seen, in any ad that I've ever seen that came out of DHEC, I never saw any warning. Now, maybe there was one, maybe I missed it, maybe it was small print. So today, do you have warnings? Do we have actually information going out and telling people about, hey, if you're going to go get the vaccine, by the way, you should be concerned about these side effects?
If you look at our website, yes, the side effects
Okay,
are there.
that's
Yes.
listed on the website.
Yes, sir.
Do we do it on like digital ads and on the campaigns and things
Yeah,
like that we're doing?
We don't really have a lot of that right now. I don't know that we had that on the ones in the past. What we have mostly been doing as a campaign lately is, it's your choice, and really aimed at parents, saying, talk to your child's pediatrician, family practitioner, get the information and then make a choice. So we're really emphasizing on the making the choice part of it at this point in what campaign we do have, but it is a much smaller campaign than it was. But if you look at our website, yes, the side effects are absolutely out there.
And going forward, now that we know, especially seeing kind of the fallout from all this, what things are we going to set up, the precautions, so that it doesn't happen again? So the next time when there's some kind of thing that we want to roll out, that the CDC and FDA are coming out and pushing and saying it's totally safe and there's basically no side effects, and then there actually are. What is DHEC, what is the state of South Carolina going to do to provide more information to people about the potential side effects? Because I guess the core thing that I'm seeing here is, it's like, it kind of goes directly to what we saw on the screen. I think it was the attorney that showed it. It's like, oh, no, we don't want to talk about the side effects because we don't want people to doubt the science or to doubt the effectiveness of vaccines. I want DHEC to doubt the effectiveness of stuff that FDA and CDC is pushing, especially when they're developing it with China. And then they're trying to cover it up. And we actually have, like, this isn't conspiracy theory stuff. This is Wall Street Journal's reporting about, literally, they're covering up the origins of this stuff. I want my DHEC people to be very skeptical about what CDC and FDA are pushing and do their own research. And I think you were trying to answer it, but I was a little taken aback to your answer to his question that's like, oh, well, we don't do that. No, we don't have that. I want somebody to be like, you know what, that's a great point. In the future, we're going to do that. Like, well, because now we know, we've seen it play out. And I guess I'm hoping that this committee will set that up and not just, because I do expect it from DHEC, but I think we need to make it clear what we expect from DHEC. To that question, how do you vet recommendations that you get from CDC and FDA that come through and they're saying, here's what does your office currently do to decide whether or not to implement?
We look at the research. We actually go back to the original articles. I do some of that. Our team does some of that. And we actually read the research and say, okay, how many people was this tested on? What happened when they were tested? Did they have a good immune response? Did they have a lower death rate? So we go back and we actually look at the numbers and make an evaluation based on what we see in that. Do we currently have the capability to do that research ourselves? No, we don't. We don't have the staff. We don't have the funding. And those studies often have thousands of people in them, which makes it difficult to do that in one location.
But if you
but we definitely do not just take their word for it. We go back and look at the original research.
And do you feel like currently, whether it's the traditional way we've done this, whether it's some kind of policy we have implemented, are you kind of hamstrung from being able to, if you're doing that research and you say, hey, this is a new technology and we don't really have a clue about this, we should do some research before we feel comfortable going out and telling our entire state it's safe and effective and it may give you cancer in 10 years and by the way, give it to your babies. Like, is there something that's keeping you from feeling comfortable to say, actually, I want to go tell the legislature we need to get this study done and this study done before we as DHEC feel comfortable following this narrative or implementing
If I
this?
thought that was the case, I would certainly let you know that.
So right now you don't feel that way. Sorry, maybe I'm being unclear. So you feel like you do have leeway right now to do that. If you felt like you needed more information to go out and implement something like that, you could come and ask for a specific South Carolina study, whether it's MUSC or USC or whomever.
I mean, would feel comfortable coming to the legislature with almost anything. You might tell me no, but that wouldn't stop me from coming. So yes, if I thought there was a concern where the legislature could be of help, whether that was giving us funding or authority or whatever it is, I would certainly do that.
So you were not aware of the testimony that came out earlier?
I've seen a couple of those folks. I think I've seen Dr. Jackson testified before, but most of those folks I've not seen before.
Sorry, I should have been, the testimony about a South Carolina university professor discovering, or research doctor, discovering that there's this weird thing that they put in the vaccines that we weren't exactly sure that may potentially cause cancer in people in the future.
No, he never shared that with us. Frankly, I wish he had, but he had not shared that with us. And as he said, it hasn't been published. So no, we did not know about that.
So if he did, and actually not even that, now that you know, is there something that you feel within your power as the head of DHEC to kind of go forth with this and do something about that information?
Well, first I'd like to talk to him. So I'm going to try to reach out and see if I can reach out to him. And I'd like to sit down and talk one-on-one, learn more about his research, and what he did. And then certainly I think the next step would be, if it looks reasonable, to talk with MUSC, the leadership there, because they would have to obviously fund the research project. And they have the facilities and that to do something like that, whereas DHEC does not currently. And see if there's interest there in pursuing what he suggested I'd call sort of phase 2 of his study.
Okay. Well, that actually is very reassuring to me, because I kind of had the same thing. I was looking at what the current law is, and it tells you as DHEC to be the agency that is investigating reported cases and prescribing preventive measures,
Sure.
researching and looking into it. Like, you are tasked with that. Now, what that looks like, I guess you've got to kind of go forth and do it. But I'm reassured that you feel like that. My other big question is directly related to that. So the fact that these doctors and some of them have not brought it to you is a concern for me. I don't know whose fault that is. Maybe it's us. Maybe it's just a lack of information about how people can. But how does a doctor or a researcher or anyone get this information to you to kind of get a red flag going that, hey, this thing that we're giving to everybody might be a serious issue? How would they go about getting that information and you doing something about it?
I mean, on our website, there is an email that reaches me it's Agency Director at dhec.sc.gov, not surprisingly. And, every message that comes to that box, I see. So if they go on our website, there's ways they can send that to us. We have a health department in every county and then some. They can go to the health department and talk to the leader there, and they will let us know. So there's many different ways they can reach out, both online and in person.
And do you actively inform doctors of that?
We could probably do a better job of that.
Because that's my other thing is DHEC asking these doctors, hey, we're in the middle of a pandemic. What are you doing and what success are you seeing with your patients on the front of COVID. And somebody says, hey, I did ivermectin, whatever. You say, oh, good, give me all that information. Are you doing that? Or is it, what is CDC saying? CDC said this, do this, and I don't want to hear any of that, and whatever you're doing, that's probably not good science, and we're not going to listen to it. That's the thing I would be concerned about it happening.
I can assure you, I've never told someone I don't want to hear from them. Now, do I listen to CDC? Yes, and I do consider what they say, absolutely. But I don't necessarily follow it without verifying it. But again, if anyone would come to us, I'm happy to listen. And like I say, Dr. Hilty and I have had several very productive meetings, at least I think.
Well, I hope going forward that DHEC, and maybe it's just, like I said, maybe it's our problem, is figuring out a way to create a more open communication line between you and the physicians that are practicing to kind of get that in. Because if you are the agency that is tasked with investigating this and dealing preventative measures to deal with it, I would think that would be a key component is figuring out how these doctors are successfully treating it and being open to much more than just one, easy cure-all. I mean, you said it's not a cure-all, but it sure seemed like certain people wanted it to be the only cure-all and the only option in the room, and the vaccine meaning. Were you aware that the inadequate, subpar, whatever, atypical, I don't know what the right word is, the way that they are investigating and doing these trials on the vaccines? Had you already heard that before? Was that nothing new?
I'd heard some of that. But again, I've also read the literature, and I think there have been some high-quality trials. That's not to say things can't be improved. No trial is perfect, to be sure. But again, I go back to the literature to see, well, what was the process they followed? What did they do? How did they test it? And I think that's very important.
All right. Well, I'm no further questions.
Representative Cromer. Senator Cromer, do you have any questions?
I would love to ask a couple questions.
Sure.
Thank you for allowing me that. So you mentioned earlier regarding the deaths, that you didn't know how many of the deaths had received the full vaccination. Did I understand that?
That's correct, yes. Again, because we don't always get that information.
Was your department, were y'all responsible for posting on social media? I think we saw a slide earlier that said so many deaths, hospitalizations, and they were unvaccinated or partially vaccinated.
At one time, we did get that information, but we no longer reliably get that information.
So in all of that information, did you know how many were fully vaccinated in those statistics?
Mostly we did. There was always somewhere we didn't know. There was a certain number where we didn't get the information, but we had better information at that time. And I'm going to look to the team here, but I believe that, as the state of emergency ended, our ability to collect data was reduced. And so that's made it more difficult to do.
Is that why the data was stopped being collected, because the emergency orders, state of emergency ended, or did it end before that?
Part of it was because the state of emergency ended. That did reduce our ability to collect data, but the quality of the data we were getting on some of those issues was already starting to decline.
And some of your data that you collected and you were looking to, was it any involving the VAERS reports?
We do look at the VAERS reports. I do personally. I know my team does. And so we do track both nationwide, but also for the state of South Carolina, because you can sort VAERS by state. We do track what is the data showing, and not only for COVID-19, but for there's other vaccines in there too, of course. So we do track that. Again, we don't have sufficient information to be able to fully work through every single case that's in there, and a lot of what's in there I don't think we would need to. If it's pain at the injection site, we probably don't need to do a lot of work on that. Obviously, if it's something serious, that would be more helpful. But at this point, because of the current state of what the information we have and also the staffing we have, we largely rely on the federal government to do that tracking, to do that investigation. And they do. And the federal government is committed to investigating serious cases that get reported in VAERS. Serious side effects, I should say.
So did you ever take those reports into consideration, the VAERS reports for South Carolina?
Yes, absolutely.
Did you hear how many, the doctors I've spoken to across different counties, different hospitals, it's such a long process, and they were so overworked, they didn't have time to fill any of those forms out. Did anyone talk to you about that?
I can tell you I've done it. And basically you go to the VAERS website, you click on the make a report, And then you get two choices. You can either go to the electronic version, which is basically a page, and then you type the information. No, it's a full page of information to type in. Or you can get a PDF form and send it in, not electronically. To me, I don't find that super, I thought it was relatively easy. Of course, I use the system too, I realize that. So I've not heard a lot of doctors tell me that it's too hard for them to use, that they won't do it, especially for the serious adverse effects. I think there is underreporting of mild side effects, yes, because they may not see the benefit to reporting a lot of the more mild ones. But certainly, I think most of our providers, and they're actually required to. I mean, the federal law says they have to, and I think most of them do report because, again, it's a requirement. They realize the importance of the reporting, and there is value in that. So I think that most of our providers are reporting, and that's certainly what they tell me.
And who paid for all the advertising? Was that federal dollars?
Mostly federal dollars, some state.
Okay. And have you read the Cochrane study that talks about the efficacy of the masks?
I have, yes.
What was your takeaway from that?
That better studies are needed, first of all. I think if you read the Cochrane study, one of the things it says is that the studies were relatively poor quality, that compliance with mask wearing in the studies was not ideal, which makes it more difficult to interpret the results. The Cochrane group did put out a editorial about that, which I actually have here. Let me quote just a little bit from it. I won't take much time for this. They say, the review examined whether interventions to promote mask wearing helped to slow the spread of viruses, and the results were inconclusive. But the review does not address the question of whether mask wearing itself reduces people's risk of contracting or spreading respiratory viruses. So I think what they're telling us there is really what they looked at is do campaigns to encourage mask wearing, increase mask wearing, but not so much whether mask wearing is effective in terms of preventing disease.
What about for the masks for the schools and the children? Are you still going to recommend that going forward?
We do not recommend general mask wearing in schools today, and I don't anticipate that we will do so in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me that.
Yes, sir.
Is it true that if you have a drug that is a treatment for a condition or a sickness or illness, that you cannot get emergency use authorization for another drug or something in the pipeline?
I don't believe that's true, but I'll have to check to be sure.
Okay. Because I heard, and that's what I was asking, because I don't know this, but I was asking maybe somebody in your staff could tell me, but I heard that that if we happen to find out that ivermectin was beneficial against COVID, or hydrochloroquine was beneficial against COVID, or table salt, that if we were to find that out, it would have prevented the vaccine from getting the EUA authorization to be rolled out so quickly and all the billions of dollars to be made. Can anybody answer that? Is that true?
I don't believe that's true, but we will double check.
Okay. I've got folks back here saying it's true, and got some doctors here and some doctors there. I think that's part of the problem.
I think that's a good point. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And I think the reason for that is that a medication to treat versus a vaccine to prevent is two different things.
Right.
I don't think that would be the same thing.
Right.
And that's why I'm saying that.
Right.
But
And the
we'll ask.
Right.
We'll
And
ask.
the reason I was kind of going down that road is somebody as learned as yourself,
Yes.
or any reasonable person, wouldn't you think that the studies, and you referenced several studies on ivermectin, hydrochloroquine, that were sort of inconclusive, didn't show anything, don't you think that they might be presented that way in order to get a new drug that is much more profitable out among the populace, like, say, the vaccine?
If those studies were done by the pharmaceutical company, I would be very worried about bias. Yes, but they weren't.
Right.
So those, Moderna and Pfizer were not doing the ivermectin studies. So they're being done independently. And I can assure you, one of the things that I did as part of my master's of public health is I spent a lot of time learning how to take a study apart and decide if it's reliable or not.
Right. Well, who funded the studies? Did you look at that? Were they may have been done by the pharmaceutical companies, but were they funded in any way by the pharmaceutical companies?
The studies I've seen were not funded by pharmaceutical companies. They had a variety of different funding sources, some private, some public.
Right. Because I looked at some studies of ivermectin that were different conclusion than what you had, that showed some decent effectiveness. And I think it's all these different studies and you're balancing plates and we're just trying to get to the truth. At the end of the day, everybody up here, and I'm sure everybody in this room, loves South Carolina and the people in it. And we just want to do what's best for them. And we just want to get to the truth and the best way we can to help our constituents. That's all. So I had a series of questions. Some of them really probably already been answered, but I want to run through them real quick. And
Sure.
for the sake of time, you can answer yes or no. And then if you don't mind, I'd like to talk to Dr. Bell for just a second, if she would come up in a minute and let me talk to her for just a second. Did DHEC do any research during COVID regarding the efficacy of various types of masking, N95 versus cloth versus surgical? Did y'all do any of your own research?
No, we did not actually put
Okay.
masks on people and see what happened. We relied on research done by others.
Okay. Did DHEC do any research in regards to the vaccine efficacy or vaccine injury or anything like that?
No. Again,
Okay.
we rely on research done by others. We do not do much independent clinical research at DHEC.
Okay. Probably the same answer here, but did DHEC do any research into ivermectin or hydrochloroquine or any other related drugs as to their effectiveness against COVID?
We did not do independent clinical research, no.
Okay. Did DHEC forbid, discourage, or dissuade any doctors from using any type of drugs to treat their patients?
No.
Okay.
No, it is not our role to tell doctors how to treat our patients. We certainly provide them information,
Okay.
but we do not have any control, again, other than controlled substances, and that's never been an issue here. We do not have any control over what a doctor prescribes.
Okay. And a lot of this, I think there was a lot of issues where doctors were finding some beneficial drugs, prescribing them, and then the doctors were coming under attack. I don't necessarily think it was an attack from you. I think it might have been more from LLR or a different state agency that the medical society or whatever. I'm sure this is just the beginning. Okay?
Right.
We are just starting down this road because trust me, this is just the beginning. So we'll get to the bottom of all that. Did DHEC forbid, discourage, or dissuade any pharmacies from dispensing any type of medications?
No, and again, we don't have that authority.
Right. Okay, that's what I thought. All right, Dr. Simmer, I did want to thank you. I think that COVID took the world by surprise. It was, as Representative Long said, it was unprecedented in my lifetime, and I think that that your agency, for the most part, tried to do a lot. I wish you could have been in a situation to do more, and I do not agree with everything that you did, but I think for the most part you did what you felt was right, and I appreciate that. And if Dr. Bell would come up, I would like to ask her a question.
And before she does, I'd just like to thank Gene and Amy. They've been incredible, so thank you.
Yes.
Both with this process, but throughout the whole, obviously, it's
Yes.
Senate Medical Affairs. So I just really wanted to give them a shout out.
Yes. Well, I call this man Mr. Brilliant, so he's.
So do we.
And Amy is Mrs. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simmer.
Trey's my Mr. Brilliant. Trey's my Mr. Brilliant.
Is
by
it?
the way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Hello, Dr. Bell.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's good to see. I know the hour's late and I won't be but a minute. This is so reflective. I remember when COVID first hit, I believe it was in maybe February of March of 2020 when it was just beginning to get out in America. DHEC and you in particular came and briefed our medical affairs committee. I mean, basically telling us, hey, this thing's coming. This is what we believe is going on and whatnot. And do you remember the question I asked you back at that meeting?
I do not. If you could remind me.
I asked you, because you were telling us a lot of, sort of facts and figures as best you could. And I asked you, I said, are you getting this information about COVID? Are you largely getting all this information from China? And you said yes, because that's the best source that we have at the time.
Now, I may have been commenting on surveillance data. At that time,
Yeah.
the largest number of cases internationally were in China, but we were relying on a number of sources of information.
Okay, that's what I took away from the meeting, that your information at the time and the world's information was so limited, and I was concerned that you were getting information out of China and perhaps how good that information may or may not be. But I also wanted to personally thank you because back during the pandemic, I blew your phone up a lot. You remember that?
Yes, sir.
And you were always so kind and gracious to answer my call. If I didn't get you, you'd call me back, and I appreciate that because I know that you were under tremendous pressure. You were extremely swamped in your job, but you're always so gracious to call me back because I had so much concern for my constituents, and I wanted to know, at this time we knew very little. And I just wanted to say I appreciated that. But I wanted to ask you a question because Dr. Simmer, what is your doctorate in? MD, okay. And you're Dr. Bell, are you more of a virologist? Or?
Internal medicine.
Internal medicine, yes. Okay. I guess this question would be applicable to you. When I was at Clemson, take a guess at what my major was at Clemson. I majored in agriculture, okay? But believe it or not, as an agriculture major, I had to have biology 101, biology 102, and micro. I also had to have chemistry 101 and chemistry 102 and organic chemistry and biochemistry. Why I had to have all that to learn how to dig a hole in the ground and plant a bush, I don't know. But I'm thankful I did. But the question I want to get to you about is natural immunity because that was just rejected when they were trying to get the jab in everybody's arm. And it was being almost mandatory. And people were losing their jobs because they didn't want to get vaccinated. And they would not allow natural immunity to substitute for the vaccine. Okay? Even if you had just gotten over COVID a few weeks prior to that. And in my limited knowledge of biology and chemistry and the way viruses infect the body and all like that, and you would know so much more about this than me, but in my limited knowledge, I pretty well knew that you did have natural immunity pretty much after anything for a little while anyway. And how robust, I don't know. We may not even know that now, but I pretty much knew that. As somebody at your level of intelligence, did you not think when they were sort of discounting natural immunity, what was your thoughts on that at the time? How did you feel about the way they were portraying natural immunity and they just weren't giving it any credence? Just from your heart and from your knowledge, what were your thoughts about that?
I wasn't aware that they were discounting natural immunity. What we knew is that there was not a test that could detect antibodies that had been shown to be protective. So there was not an antibody level that we could measure as effective in protecting against disease. However, we did account for natural immunity, for example, in our guidance for schools. And we advised people if they had had a recent infection that we could presume that they had a form of natural immunity for several months. So that just one example in the school setting, if a child had evidence of, documented evidence of an infection within a 3-month period, then they wouldn't have to be considered a close contact if they were exposed.
Right. Well, kudos to that, because while the big pharma was pushing the federal government and others to discount natural immunity, you all were taking that in consideration, and that's what this panel wants. We appreciate that. We appreciate DHEC's doing evaluation like that and giving those recommendations where, you were kind of swimming against the stream in that regard because you, as a scientist and a doctor, you understood natural immunity. And even though you can't quantify what number, like 57 is, and I think it varies within tests. My wife took a test to see about her natural immunity like 4 or 5 months after COVID, and her number was like 231. And I took one and then I got to saying, well, wow, I mean, she's super mom, or whatever. But then come to find out, there may be different numbers for different style tests. So is that true, or have they got some sort of standardized test now that they're doing the natural immunity studies on?
There's not a test that is generally available commercially for people to assess from previous infection whether or not they are protected against disease. But in research settings, they may be able to test for antibodies that are developed in response to natural immunity and to vaccination.
And are those antibodies that are developed from infection, are they longer lasting than the protection you get from a vaccine?
So studies have looked at the duration of immunity from both natural infection and from vaccination, and they and it is suggested, there is evidence to suggest that the duration of immunity from natural disease or vaccination might be equivalent. There are other studies that suggest that duration of immunity from vaccination might be longer. That can depend on each individual's immune system. So if you're older, you might not mount as strong an immune response. If you have a weakened immune system, you might not measure as strong an immune response. So it can vary from individual to individual.
Okay. Well, it's 6 o'clock. We've had a long day. I wanted to thank you all for coming. But do you remember when I sent you around Christmas time? That was an appreciation for all your help. Does anyone have any closing remarks before we break up? Yes, Representative Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I was just going to say that we've got a lot of work ahead of us because might be a few things that our state got right, but I think there's a lot more things that we got wrong. And after hearing all the testimony today from the attorneys, from the university professors, from the doctors, and from DHEC, I'm leaving with more questions than answers today. And of course, I'm committed to working to protect liberties of the people of South Carolina, along with everybody on this committee. And whatever you need from us, we want to do.
Well, thank you, Representative Long. And, I think in a matter like this, I think it is just fabulous that the House and Senate are working together. Nothing gets passed in this state unless it passes both bodies. And we should work together on this issue going forward. And I was thrilled to have the opportunity to get with you guys on this. And when I heard you were thinking about having your own hearings, it just made sense for us all to do this together. 6 heads are better than one, right? 7 heads are better than one. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I guess it's after 6. I'm going to officially, if no one has anything else, I will officially adjourn this meeting.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.